is your nonprofit generating value for people? Even in the nonprofit world, it should be generating value for people. Now, in some ways where I think nonprofits can really get off the rails, and they can get off the rails through, I would say, administrative bloat. They can get off the rails through mission creep. They can get off the rails by providing services that people aren't really asking for, but somebody wrote a big check and the money's got to go somewhere. And so it's interesting. We're at a unique kind of crossroads with NGOs and nonprofits where it's very clear to me that sometimes they can do more harm than help, even with good intentions if they're not structured well.
When you give in the nonprofit world, is there a framework to make sure that it's having the impact you want? And what is the impact you want to have when you give?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're quite intentional in that area. And I guess to give some needed context here, part of the reason why the commitment to giving, there's, I would say, kind of a spiritual, ideological thought process about it. There's a business thought process about it. But the first 9 years of my career, I worked in a nonprofit role where I had to raise my salary. So I very intimately understand what it's like to be on the other side of the table. Now that I'm on more of the giving side, I have a lot of perspectives that were kind of forged in the fires of raising financial support and seeing firsthand the challenges that come with that. So I try and approach the process of giving with quite a bit of empathy from the experiences that I've had. But when you start to give at scale, which is we're at this point, I think we're kind of giving at scale several $1 million a year. There's obviously a lot of people that are going to be interested in talking to you about their organization. And, thankfully, that's because there are a lot of people doing interesting and important work in the world. Unfortunately, the world's never going to be at a deficit for hard things or people that are going through difficulties or people that need help. So we've been inundated, really. I've probably met, I don't know, at least 500 or 600 nonprofits in my office over the last 3 or 4 years. And we realized pretty early on that, like, man, we're going to have quite a system built. So fortunately, my wife, who has not worked for the company, but has a real interest in the giving side of it, she came in and helped provide some structure to it. And at this point, we have a pretty robust kind of framework of how we think through it, how we give it. Happy to talk about all of that. But in general, the way that I think about giving, I think this is the easiest paradigm to use, is that I think about it just like I would think about angel investing, that I am looking for exceptional people that are highly committed to a mission that I think will make a meaningful impact on people's lives. And then I give towards those things. I am not highly controlling of the money. I'm looking for great people that can invest it well in impacting people's lives. And then I give it and I get out of the way mostly. And I have a portfolio kind of investments that I make through giving and that the company makes through giving. But we're looking for impact in people's lives. There's all kinds of interesting characteristics, I think, that I've seen the founders and the leaders in the nonprofit world that we tend to like to invest in. But generally, that's our approach.
Okay. Love that. Love the intentionality of it. And when I do it, I only invest where I can actually get involved to make sure it's happening. And seeing and working with a lot of nonprofits, it's challenging to raise the money and do that. And when it shifts to payroll is more important than the impact because they're stressed about it, I totally get how hard that is. So 100%. Without going too deep, because I want to get into a number of things here, what advice, because you had 10 years in a nonprofit, what advice do you have for nonprofit organizations to kind of shore it up to where you can be more stable financially and really focus on the impact? Like, is there something there that was different in how you approached it, if you understand that question?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I will call out one macro theme that I see. There's a new kind of field, sometimes it's called social entrepreneurship, where you kind of have the nonprofit world and the for-profit world kind of intermingling. In my experience, the most effective nonprofits that we're working with are actually starting to incorporate market dynamics and how they run the nonprofit. So I'll give an example. We work with a water charity here in Oklahoma called Water For, and I knew very little about clean drinking water. Obviously, providing clean drinking water, especially in places like Africa, has been an initiative that people have been passionate about for quite a long time. And to me, it wasn't inherently obvious why it wasn't already solved. Interestingly, over the course of you and I's lifetime, a lot of issues have kind of been solved, but this one has not. What I found is that generally the way that it used to work was you say, oh, these people need a well so they can have clean drinking water and not the nasty, water from the nearby lake that the animals are bathing in and stuff. And they have to walk multiple miles to get. So some white people come in with some money, drill a well, we take some photos. There's a big celebration. We leave. 18 months later, the well doesn't work anymore. Nobody was ever really empowered to maintain the well. There's no money to maintain the well because the money was used to drill the well. And so there's some kind of crazy stat that the average well in Africa is derelict within 12 to 18 months. And what Water For does that I think is pretty brilliant, and again, I'm seeing this dynamic be put into action by some of the most forward-thinking nonprofits, is they say, well, okay, if we're really providing value to people in these countries, then they are going to be willing to pay for that. Now, their ability to pay might not be as high as the total cost, but if we're adding value, certainly they're willing to pay. And so what they do is they raise the money to drill the well, and then they make all of the maintenance and daily costs of the well. All of those are paid for by selling the water. In fact, they cover even more than those costs by selling the water. So it guarantees that people locally are invested in the upkeep of the well, and that well actually becomes an income producing asset because the community is benefiting from it. And then they take some of that profit and they use it to drill more wells. And to me, that's a really fascinating thought process / question, which is your nonprofit generating value for people? Because even in the nonprofit world, it should be generating value for people. Now, whether people's ability to pay for that value and how much they can pay for it, that's a different issue, but it should be generating value that people want to pay for. And in some ways where I think nonprofits can really get off the rails, and they can get off the rails through, I would say administrative bloat. They can get off the rails through mission creep. They can get off the rails by providing services that people aren't really asking for, but somebody wrote a big check and the money's got to go somewhere. It's when they're not actually measuring or providing value that the people who are receiving it would be willing to pay for and to do something to receive. And so it's interesting. We're at a unique, I think, kind of crossroads with NGOs and nonprofits, where it's very clear to me that sometimes they can do more harm than help, even with good intentions, if they're not structured well. And so we spend a lot of time looking at those kind of things, like how are you structured? And we have some other standards that are really important to us. Like, we do not want to be more than a certain percentage of an organization's budget. A story from my past, I worked at this nonprofit for 2 years. My salary my first year was $18,000, struggled to raise it. My biggest donor, I think, was giving $300 a month. And, which was a lot of my support base at that point. It was like, 10 to 20%. And, after 2 years, I decided I'm going to do this. My wife was going to join me. So we were going to have to raise more support. And we went to this whole training. And then the way it was supposed to work is you come back from the training and you make sure everybody who's with you is still with you. And then you go out and you raise the other support. And so we're at the very beginning of kind of the reconfirming, commitments stage. And my biggest donor had just gone through a divorce where the husband ran off with a bunch of the money, and she went to zero. And so it was like, man, what a punch in the stomach, where you think I've already got to raise a bunch of money, but at least I've got a base. And it's like, well, maybe you don't. And the reality is that a lot of times nonprofits take the money and then they use that to hire people. And so if all of a sudden they lose a significant chunk of funding, like 20% of their funding goes away overnight, then, people are losing jobs. It's incredibly disruptive to the work. So we try to be giving at a level where we think it's very sustainable and that the particular nonprofit's not overly dependent on us.
Yeah, there is a lot of sort of deploy the capital and watch it crumble. And I like what you're saying around let's deploy it and watch it grow and build. And there's a number of nonprofits out there, especially in the the veteran space that have made them dependent, not self reliant. So it isn't growing. And so much money being given to try to do good in the world. And I love that people have the heart and they want to do that. But man, I encourage everyone to look at it to make sure it's really having the impact. And just like I've started 8 companies from scratch. The biggest one sold for 9 figures in 2016. It was aviation aftermarket. We're in 60 countries, around the world. And just get to see a lot of stuff out there. And when it comes to, the organization, I always thought about making it recession proof. I've heard you talk about, creating moats so you can defend what you're doing. But my version was always, let's make it as recession proof as possible. For example, aviation aftermarket emission was safely reducing aircraft operating costs. In good times, we can save you 100 million plus a year on your maintenance costs. In bad times, isn't it a lot more important to save that money to safely fly your missions?
Yeah.
How do you think about that? Because I see a lot of folks kind of go off in a direction and they think nothing's going to change and it's going to be fine. I think it's 100% of the time on the table to be making sure we're improving how recession proof we are. Talk about that a little bit.
So there's 2 ways that you can make your company recession proof, and generally only 2 ways that I can think of. The first is that you build a culture around intrinsically motivated people where they're very integrated and very bought in to the team that they're on, that it's less like a job and it's more like a community and a cause that they belong to. And this is true nonprofit, for profit. If you can create that, so if you think about it, like the biggest threat to your business in a recession is that hard times lead to people saying, well, I'm not willing to sacrifice any, or I don't want to go through hard times. I'm going to go find something else. Right. So that's the first thing, is how do you make your team resilient? And I think the way you make your team resilient is by having a clear sense of mission and purpose and community and relationships and values that govern it and help it to have cohesiveness during challenging periods. And generally what you find is teams like that get stronger when it gets harder, that the pressure, kind of like pressure produces a diamond, that pressure actually produces something good instead of something bad. Whereas if you get a team of extrinsically motivated people, the more mercenary mindset people, the moment it gets hard, it's like, I'm just looking to what I can jump to where I won't have to go through this. The second part of it is pretty straightforward. And that is there are all these things you do not control. You don't control the economy. You don't control the Federal Reserve. You don't control whether the US and China have good trade relations or in a war. You don't control what your competitors do. But what you do control is the money that you spend. And so generally, running a profitable company, running a intelligent personal balance sheet if you're the owner of the company, having some conservatism with the amount of debt you take on, like Warren Buffett famously said, there's only one way to go bankrupt, and that's debt. And that if you're responsible in those areas, then, so I'll give a really practical example here. I own about half of Simple Modern. I don't own all of it, but I own about half. That was intentional. I wanted to involve other people in the equity upside of it, people that help build the company. Let's say next year, let's say Trump enacts 50% tariffs across the board. I have no idea what he'll do, but let's just say he does that. That'd be really detrimental on the short term for our business. Could lead to a recession, who knows? But let's just say that something like that happened. Well, that only is a real problem for my team if I have not planned, or if the way that I'm living my personal lifestyle, I have to get a certain amount of money out of the business. And so like the way that we're structured with our shareholders, it's like, we don't have debt, or we have very little debt, and we don't have lavish personal lifestyles. And so it's like, okay, well, the company made half as much money this year because of economic headwinds, and we're fine. What do we need to do? How do we need to adjust as a team? And okay, let's get after it, because those are going to happen. Like you said, the drawdowns, the headwinds, those are a given. I mean, 21 and 22 were brutal. Shipping costs went up 5x, 6x for us in like a very short period of time. I mean, there was nowhere to hide basically from the inflation during that period. And so if you were a business, and there were several people in consumer goods that were this way, if you were leveraged to the hilt, you're dead. You're dead. Doesn't matter how smart you are, doesn't matter how good your brand is. A company that owned Pyrex, for example, and it went bankrupt as a part of the process. And so that's probably what I would encourage people to do, is that you build a highly value-based, mission-based, relationship-based team, and then you run things with a kind of financial pragmatism where you expect periods where things don't go as well. And then, you know what? The economic headwinds don't really faze you, from my perspective.
Yeah, I always kind of ran at the discipline around financial decisions where we'll distribute this to cover taxes and a little bit extra for shareholders. And I've always controlled the majority of my businesses as well. But I let others in for the same reason that you did. And wow, did it work well. When I did it right, some lessons there that I had to learn as I was figuring it out. But then the rest of it would stay in the business. And this is what we did every year. It was never, oh, look what we made. What's the owner going to do? Or let's make a decision. Nope, we've already decided that. And went from, I think, starting out a $70,000 credit line, grew to over 23 years, a $36 million credit line. Never used even half of it, had way more than that in inventory and equipment. And so I think having discipline around these financial decisions also helps with what you're talking about. Did you employ some of the same stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, Lee, when I talk to other people that have done the thing and been successful, it's amazing. It might not be the exact same chorus, but it sure does rhyme. Like we learn the same principles. And I think actually one that you said there that's worth calling out is, this is actually one of the reasons why I would really encourage people to think about sharing equity with the other people that build your team, is that if you want people to think like owners, if you want them to think about downturns the way that you do, then make them owners. Like it's really straightforward. If you want people not spending money frivolously, then make them owners. Like obviously some of it is who you recruit, but some of it also is incentives. And so I think that we absolutely, one of the things we did recently is we became an ESOP. So literally everybody in the company owns some piece of the company. And so we can kind of cast vision for that, hey, when we are efficient here, and here, it leads to the company valuation going up, and that directly impacts, the value that you have in your ESOP. And for my other co-owners that were part of building the company, part of the reason why they're going to endure the hard times is this isn't just my thing that they're a part of. This is their thing. We all have mutual ownership of it. But I do think in general, like having the ability, spending less than you make is just a life skill, and they have the marshmallow test. I don't know if you're familiar with this, that they give kids. It turns out that the willingness to put off reward, that is one of the most predictive characteristics you can have. Patience, really. It's one of the most predictive characteristics of future success of any of the things they can measure. And this is just one more example of that. But I'm really big on thinking about playing things all the way out, 5, 10, 20 years. And are you doing things in a way that is going to age well, that's going to be defensible, that's going to be sustainable? There's a lot of people in the business world that'll post 2 or 3 years of really explosive growth and they'll get the stories and the adulation, but then they're not able to sustain it. I'm much more fascinated with the stories of people that have sustained success for long periods of time. And your question kind of points at this. Those people always have stories of real adversity, of real headwinds that they had to work through. And so I think it's part of just building something sustainable in general, is that you're building the entire organization, you're using your money, you're thinking this way from the beginning, that I don't know when it's going to come, but it will come, right?
Yeah. And like you, from what I got from some of your podcasts that you were on, I never took a dollar of outside investment from anyone. And boy, was it nice not having to mess around with that. And I think not having money at different critical stages made me so much smarter. Like the numbers just flowed through me. Like, why did we spend a penny on that? What's going on? I had to hit the road and sell. And then you get this work and you have to spend all this money to be able to do it. And how do you make it all match? I mean, you were going through the same stuff. I made every mistake I think you can possibly make. The first year I almost went out of business probably 15 times. When you were starting out, what was it like for you with Simple Modern? I mean, what were some of the biggest lessons that you learned? I could go on for hours about mine. But
Yeah, man. And, you know, it really resonates with me. When we started the company, we started it with seed money from me. And it's funny. I tell people that we were bootstrapped for two reasons. One is I have this kind of idealistic bent. I wanted the company to be about generosity, and, you know, investors aren't going to be very excited about the idea that, you know, you're going to take a bunch of the profits and you're going to give it away. But there was another reason that we didn't raise money. And that was, everybody thought it was a terrible idea. Like, nobody had the vision that this was actually going to, it's like Yeti's going to absolutely smoke you. You know, like, I've got an uncle asking me at Christmas, like, how's your Yeti knockoff thing doing? You know, it's like nobody caught the vision. Nobody believed in it. And so the result of being bootstrapped was that I guess here's the misconception about capital in general from my perspective. The misperception is that capital is what enables success. And I sometimes, very rarely, can you say, hey, the way that market went, the reason why that business was successful is because it just had a bunch of capital. But the vast majority of the time, that's not the case. And one of the reasons for that is because my belief is that scarcity actually is a force multiplier of sorts. That scarcity is a little bit like a magnifying glass is for the sun. That if you just stand in the sun, you get warm. If you take a magnifying glass and you focus it, you can start a fire. And actually, if you focus light enough, you can get a laser. And that's what scarcity does. Scarcity forces you to focus your resources and your time and your efforts and your thoughts and your energy into a pretty tight beam. And it helps you to build judgment. And really, honestly, business life is so much about judgment. It's just, do you have good judgment or not? And in those early days, we just had to develop excellent judgment about how we spent money. And like you said, that doesn't mean you're always right, because we definitely weren't. Sounds like you weren't either. I don't know that anybody's like, yeah, I got it all right. But we were exceptionally thoughtful. We were exceptionally deliberate. And every time we invested money, we thought pretty hard about it. And what happened is we were hand to mouth on resources constantly for like the first 5 or 6 years of the business. And then we finally hit breakthrough. We weren't hand to mouth anymore. And we realized we've got some really strong muscles that we've built when it comes to capital allocation and vetting investment ideas, thinking through where to put money and what not to spend money on, that have served us incredibly well. And really, if there's a problem, the quote unquote problem is we trained ourselves that we're not going to do an investment unless we can return, 2 to 4x the capital in a year on this investment. That's what we had to do because we had no capital. And then as you get bigger and bigger and you have more capital, you're like, okay, I gotta teach myself to bring that bar down, and to say yes to some things that I would have said no to before. So that's been an adjustment for us. But really, even today, the world we're living in, we got way more capital than I know how to invest. And so the problem has, I'm pretty convinced the problem has never been capital in our business, even though capital was really scarce at points. It's do you have the judgment and the discernment of knowing how to use that capital effectively? And this is also why capital can be a curse, that if you're just, if you're in a place where you have lots of investment dollars, you're not going to think as critically through the decisions. It's very easy to spend somebody else's money. And as a result, you never build the competencies that you have to have. Maybe a parallel I draw here. We all want our kids to go further in life than we have. But interestingly, the way that we achieve that, the way that we help our kids to be the most successful is counterintuitive, which is, for my children, if I want my children to go further in life than I have, then I have to help them fail. because what all the research says is failing is actually the thing that produces the resiliency and the learning and the competencies that they're going to need to be successful adults. And so if I'm constantly rescuing them from things and not letting them deal with the ramifications of failure, then I'm stunting their growth. A business where you have so much capital that any mistake doesn't hurt and things can be glossed over is it's the same problem, just in a different form, which is you're removing the element that can actually help people build the muscles that they need to be great at business.
Yeah, I love that. One of our clients for my business, ETW, it was called or is called Dinner Table. The board called me in back in May and said, "Hey, would you come in and help us with this thing? Because, the original idea didn't work." And I said, "Sure, but it's going to be a complete iteration, totally different than we did before." And now dinnertable.com is all about communities of families raising kids to create value in the world and a place to go for practical family wisdom and build on it. And in a very short time, I'll get to my point here, a very short time, we built over 18,000 parents in the community, 6 months flat, not even quite, and a number of paid communities. But when we go through this, we have something around operationalizing a value creation culture within families. And so holding that up, how you talk about value creation, house rules for the family, financial competency, but it's healthy struggle. So here's the interesting thing, with the best of intentions, parents, to your point, have been taking struggle away from kids. So they're not ready for adulthood when they get there. And I've heard a lot of entrepreneurs say, and I think I've heard you say similar things in your podcast, that had I known how hard this would be, maybe I wouldn't have done this. This is really hard. But how could we grow in any way, shape, or form without some struggle? Right. And struggle is just an effort to improve life condition, get a capability, character trait, whatever that is. And my early couple of folks that I brought on with me, gave them equity. I couldn't pay them the first year. One of them said to me, if I knew how hard this was going to be, I never would have done it. But he got a check for over $30 million when I sold it. That was cool.
That is cool.
And I'm looking at it and saying, this is actually really good. It's like going to the gym for business. And so rather than if it was so hard, if I knew that it was going to be this hard, I wouldn't do it. Well, it's going to be hard and rewarding, like self-esteem, and all of this kind of comes from that. Has your thinking evolved around that? Because I've learned to love hard. I've learned to trust the struggle.
Yeah. It's interesting. I have read that the easiest way to describe testosterone is that it's a drug that makes effort feel good, which I thought it's just a fascinating way to describe that like pushing yourself feels good. And that's one of the reasons why testosterone can drive like people to achieve things that they wouldn't be able to achieve. In a similar way, I think we want to wire our brains where they appreciate and enjoy struggle, like you're saying. To draw another analogy, I like sports. I'm a big fan of college football, the Oklahoma City Thunder. And it's interesting because when you go to a sports game, you want to win. You want your team to win, but you actually want your team to win in a particular type of way. You want your team to win in a way where there's a lot of struggle and a lot of uncertainty in the middle of the game. And there's some highs and lows in there. And then there's a moment near the end of the game where your team overcomes the struggle and, succeeds, wins. And so if your team's really, really good, like, Alabama football of the last 10 years, then most of your games are actually not that enjoyable because there's not a lot of upside. You're blowing people out. You're expected to win by 5 touchdowns, whatever. And so there's actually an interesting truism about life and about the way that we work that's hidden in there, which is that you want to intentionally structure your life where there is a healthy amount of struggle, where success isn't guaranteed. And that's actually what makes it so enjoyable and so sweet when you do have success. If you know you're going to succeed in whatever you're working at, then it loses a lot of the sense of accomplishment and it loses a lot of the enjoyment that you would take from it. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm always setting goals for myself that I might miss. Like I'm a big believer in the idea that you set stretch goals. So like a good example from this year, I've gotten much more into lifting, and I was like, I'm going to try and lift 10 million pounds this year. I'm not going to get there. I'm going to get to like 8 million pounds. And so it was a very aspirational goal. I had a period with a lot of travel and I didn't get there, but I lifted a lot more this year than I ever have. And it also gives me motivation for next year. I'm like, I could get there and I see how I could get there, but I'm not quite there yet. And I think when we're establishing personal goals for ourselves that are a struggle and where success isn't guaranteed, it creates a great environment for us to grow. I mean, it's trite, like it's the journey, not the destination. But especially people that have been to, the quote unquote mountaintop, like you and I have been. If you ask us, I guess I'll ask it this way. Lee, were your favorite days of your companies, were they at the end where you were crushing it, or were they at the beginning where you were getting it figured out?
Oh my gosh, it was all the way through it. But one thing I would say, the harder it got, the harder we laughed. And that's how I knew we had the culture right.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I remember a day really early on with Simple Modern. It's basically my second, big success I've been a part of. And I was in the office with a bunch of guys. I mean, we didn't even have an office the first year. We literally ate, we ate at Panera, or we met in the upstairs of my house. But we finally got an office, very modest, like 1,000 square foot office. And I was sitting around with the guys one day and I just said, hey, really savor this, because 5 or 6 years from now, when we're at a totally different level, you're going to look back and you're going to be like, man, those were great days. All you can feel right now is the tension of wanting to be past this stage, but allow yourself to enjoy it. And I think that that's probably the other key, is that tension seeks resolution. And when we feel tension, when we have a goal and we know we feel like we can achieve it, all we want to do is get to the next step. And so some of what I've gotten a little bit better at is just like, when I'm in that tension, kind of savoring it and being like, instead of just every kind of fiber of my being like, I want to be the next step, instead being able to say, I'm going to enjoy this step. And yes, I do want to progress past this to the next thing. But if all I'm thinking about is that I'm missing the point, I want to enjoy this time and this step that I'm in right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And my internal dialogue keeps changing around this particular state that we'll be in. And now it's sort of, well, when I earn the next step, it'll be there. And then I get this sort of warm feeling inside. This is going to be really cool when I figure it out. And I think this goes from that whole concept that I've heard you talk about, 0 to 1 is way harder than 1 to 2 and some of the other steps. The thing is hard for startup entrepreneurs from 0 to 1 is you have to figure things out that you don't know the answers to it. You don't have a formula, but you have to lean in my view, be on the front line doing this stuff, not just
Absolutely
theoretically. And they're scared of that for some reason. So I think we can flip our mindset and say, no, we're going to be comfortable being uncomfortable and lean into that.
There's an arbitrage there with what you just said that I want to call out for anybody listening to this, which is the amount of fear that people feel about something with which they have no experience is dramatically overstated. So the amount of intimidation and fear I will feel about, I don't know, I've never flown, right? I've had friends who've flown, but I've never flown. The amount of intimidation I would feel about flying is going to be radically more than I will feel after my first flight lesson. Like, one flight lesson will reduce the amount of anxiety and intimidation I feel by sometimes by an order of magnitude. And so ignorance, complete ignorance, drives real anxiety, and it prevents people from starting the process of learning. And that's why 0 to 1 is so hard for many people, is because the internal emotional hump that they feel. I mean, this is the way a bunch of people are with AI right now. It's like, it's out there. They don't really know anything about it. They haven't really experienced it. It's just scary, right? And it's interesting. I took a couple guys to a lecture about AI a week ago, and a couple guys that I work with, and there was nothing groundbreaking in this lecture, but it was amazing how much it changed their perspective on AI. It went from kind of just this kind of scary idea to like, oh, I'm starting to get a couple of ideas of how we could start to maybe look at this or pursue this, whatever. It became much less intimidating just with an hour of information. So there's actually this interesting arbitrage, and that the amount of intimidation we're going to feel when we know nothing is way disproportionately high. And then once we know a little bit, the amount of intimidation we have is way disproportionately low. This is Dunning-Kruger, that as we start to know a little bit about something, then we flip and we go the other way, where we're now way overestimating our ability and underestimating how hard it is. And this is exactly what you go through in the early days. The other thing that you said that I want to underline it. I will have people come to me for business advice all the time. I do quite a bit of mentoring. And there are so many times where they're like, okay, there's this X area of my business and I'm trying to figure out who to hire and I don't have any experience. And I'll say, okay, well, why are you hiring somebody to do that? And they'll say, well, because I don't know anything about it. And so my follow-up question is, well, then how are you going to hire the right person if you don't even know what to screen for? And this is one of the most powerful reasons why in the 0 to 1 early days, like you do almost everything, because you have to have some level of literacy about it, or how do you hope to build a team or to select the right people to do that thing? But a lot of times, because people are really intimidated, they just say, I don't want to touch it at all. I don't want to know anything about it. I'm just going to hire somebody who knows something about that. And that's a form of kind of, basically, it's another form of what you said earlier about how nonprofits and families with their kids can sometimes make them, it can stunt the maturation process. That we can do the same thing with companies. If we say, well, that area is scary, I'm just going to hire an expert and I'm not going to do any of it. Then the expert comes in, the expert's incentivized to make you feel like you don't know anything and to, that you have to have them, and you never develop as a business leader and your understanding of that area. I mean, even to take it a step further, let's say you do go hire somebody great in an area that you don't know as much about. If you know nothing about that area, how do you coach them? How do you give them leadership? How do you give them guidance? You can't. So I'm a very big believer that when you're in the 0 to 1 phase, you pretty much have to have the view that you're going to do everything, at least for a while.
Well, the thing I like about leaning in and on the front lines of all these things that we need to solve for that we don't have a formula is I can always see the next step. And I find that most people can see the next step if they're actually willing to do it. And bringing the experts in to put a spin on that, I've watched so much money be wasted where they come and they do their thing, they throw it over the wall and say, well, I did what you told me to do. Please give me my check. But they're not connected to the business model, your strategy, your culture, the actual value of your product or service. So again, we have to lean in and do it. And when you hear this, the people talking about risk taking. Well, I don't have that gene. I can't take risks. I've always thought it was less risky working for myself. If I work for a company, I could get laid off. How did you think about that? And once I started my first business, it took me about a second to go, wow, this feels so much better and less risky.
Well, I think it's about, I guess I would start here. Life is risky, right? You wake up every day, you can have a heart attack, you don't control hardly anything. I mean, control's mainly an illusion. So once you just kind of say the amount of systemic risk in your life is enormous and basically cannot be mitigated, then you have a different conversation, which is not can I get away from risk, but what are the trade-offs? Where can I control where the risk is? And this is so to give an example. Early on, we picked a manufacturing partner, and we just made our 50 millionth bottle, and it was done with the same manufacturer we made our first bottle with. So the traditional thought process is that if you're manufacturing overseas, and we do some domestically also, but if you're manufacturing overseas, that you want to have several manufacturers. You want to diversify your manufacturing base. And you want to do that because then you can kind of play them against each other on costs. And you want to do that in case one of them has a problem that, you have redundancy or whatever. So we started, 2, 3, 4 years in the company. We started saying, hey, do we need to kind of diversify and have multiple manufacturers? And when we looked at the problem, we realized you've got a basket of risks either way. They're just different risks, right? For example, if you have several different manufacturers, you're taking your volume and you're distributing it. The number one thing that gets you preference and deferential treatment in a factory is your size and where you are kind of in the pecking order of customers. So if you diffuse your volume across several factories, you're mitigating risk in some ways. One of the factories burns to the ground, and okay, you're still producing, but you're creating a whole nother amount of risk in another area, which is if my if my volume is distributed, then I'm not that important to anybody. I'm only, kind of important to 5 people as opposed to really important to one person. And you could take that and there's like 50 of them on either side is what we basically found. There's all kinds of risks from concentration and there's all kinds of risk from diversification. And so, we could talk about stocks. Like if you are concentrated, then you have a lot more risk of, going negative 50 or negative 80% on your position. But if you want to beat the market, you can't be diversified. Diversification basically dooms you to not beating the market. And they say at like 10 or 11 stocks, even if you just threw a dart at a dartboard at 10 or 11 stocks, you're probably going to perform at about the market. So what we saw was there's a whole bunch of things in our business that we can pick our basket of risk. And the same is true about being an entrepreneur in general, right? Like I started a company, I put in a lot of my savings to start it. And you could say, well, that's a lot of risk. That thing could have gone bankrupt and you could have lost that money. And I would say, yeah, that's true. But you know what? If I had stayed at the business I was working at, that had a lot of risk. There ended up being a bankruptcy a few years down the line there. Or if I took a job at a Fortune 500, then I'm always subject to a layoff or something I don't control. And so as an entrepreneur, you're trading risks. And one of the ways you're trading them is you're saying, I am going to trade for a basket of risks where I have more agency, but maybe the downsides are bigger, but I have more agency in those downsides. And if they happen, then if I work at XYZ Corp and I don't have a lot of agency, but maybe there's more stability in most years. And so this is how I've come to think about it, is I've just come to think about what are the different trade-offs of risk that happen in every decision and what is the basket of risks that I feel good about. And I think for most people, if you develop this framework, there's some people who shouldn't be entrepreneurs, right? You married a spouse where like, that's going to be a bad idea. Like that's not going to work with that spouse, or you don't have the temperament for it. And that's fine. Like people should, know yourself to lead yourself. But at the same time, one of my big tests, I think, of emotional and intellectual intelligence is, are people able to see around an issue? And so when somebody kind of comes out and dogmatically says, this is the right way to do this, then that kind of communicates to me lower intelligence, because what it sounds like is that you can't see around that thing to see all the risks and the trade-offs. So anyway, I think it's a fascinating question of how we deal with risk in our lives. And I think there's a lot of things that are perceived as quote unquote risky that are quite a bit less risky in other ways than the alternatives. It's just, do we have the ability to kind of think through issues? I'll give one more example. The first 15 hires at Simple Modern, 14 out of the 15 I'd known for a decade. So here's what that meant. That meant that I had less risk of somebody stealing from me. I had less risk of conflict with my team. I had less risk of somebody just saying, hey, somebody offered me $10,000 more. I'm leaving, But if the company had failed, I had tremendous relational risk, right? Like almost a bunch of my close friendships are all going to lose their job if the company goes bankrupt. So like it would have been devastating to my personal life. But I always have felt like, hey, because we did it that way, that's part of the reason why we were successful. So anyway, great question. I went on and on, but I think it's something worth spending a lot of time reflecting on for people.
Yeah, and in a way, with that initial team, we're all in this together. It wasn't my fault that we lost. We're all in it. We're all the CEOs of our own role, and we gave it our best shot. And isn't that amazing? Coming in. I like this concept of being really good at, I recently had Mark Miller. He was with Chick-fil-A from a very small number of stores to like 28,000 stores, crazy growth.
Yeah.
And he's simplified it really well. And I 100% agree. It's like you need to be really good at the numbers and really good at relationships. And you have to do both. And you can see people that don't do that well that are only good at one or the other. And it sounds like you've really focused on both. I love that, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that for us, we've done a really good job with culture and hiring exceptionally high character people. But the reason why we've won has been the combination of that and an absolute dedication, obsession with excellence. And it's that combo. If you can get that, if you can get exceptional character and exceptional drive towards excellence, then like it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be successful, is my view, because the market has unlimited demand for excellence.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, we create the environment from which everybody creates value, and there's rules, there's systems, there's, rituals, all of that go into that. And usually for every 10 that get fired in most companies, 7 or 8 will thrive if they're in the right environment. So a lot of that's on us going forward. I am curious to shift gears a little bit. What's interesting in many things, but one thing that's really interesting to me about your business is it's a lifestyle business. You have affiliates, or license agreements essentially with, sports teams. And people are getting this stuff, and it is like a watch or wardrobe, and it helps them feel a certain way. How do you intentionally build that? Do you have focus groups? Like, is there a process you go through? My guess is you've thought deeply about this.
Yeah. I mean, we're very good at gathering lots and lots of data about our customers. And our team is really, like, I would say, digitally native. And so the internet has been transformative in the ability to understand it's interesting because in some ways the internet separated us from our customers, whereas 200 years ago, we would have had a lot of conversations face to face. And so you have to kind of work through that, because in some ways you can be more disconnected from the people you're serving with the power of the internet. But the thing the internet brings to the table is you can talk to so many more people. Just as an example, if we're coming up with some new designs, let's say for Valentine's Day, we can generate 50 or 100 ideas within a day, thanks to Photoshop and all the tools that we have. We don't have to go make 50 or 100 of them. And then we can send out a survey and we can get 20,000 responses in an hour. So we can go in literally a day. We can go from we have nothing to a bunch of ideas generated and 20,000 customers giving us their opinion. And you can do that in one workday. And that's amazing, and AI is just going to speed this stuff up. Like there's a tool one of our industrial designers uses that she can sketch something in about 5 minutes. She can feed it to the AI and it can give you a photorealistic image of what that thing would look like within seconds. And so like we can literally come from like we're standing around a whiteboard to like a photorealistic image of what that thing might look like within a half hour. And that's amazing. It's also amazing to be able to have that ability to show customers things, because it's a lot easier to show people something and say, hey, what do you think of this, than it is to kind of ask them conceptually. So it's an exciting time. I think that is both the promise and the threat of technology, is that technology is going to enable us to do things that we never could have done before, or that when we did them, they were very laborious. And it's going to allow us to do them almost instantly. And it's also making us more and more disconnected, anxious, lonely, depressed than ever. And the optimistic future that we want to strive towards is where we learn as a society how deeply we need time with other people and interpersonal connection and community. And we're still able to take advantage of all of these advantages that all of the capabilities that technology offers, without some of the dystopian things that it can do to us and the isolation it can cause. And we'll see. The jury's still out. But one of the things that is really clear to me is like we are in, Jeff Bezos famously said within the last few years that Amazon's in day one, and it's not the end of day one. It's like we just hit the alarm clock on day one. We are in the very, 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 very beginning of what the internet and technology is going to do. And future generations are going to look back and, they're going to laugh at us, probably the way we would laugh if we saw what the first cavemen did with fire. But I think that the way that it's been done up until this point is not the way that it has to be done. And this is the role of leaders, is reimagining and from a first principles thinking, asking, how can we use this technology in a way that both encourages and fosters human connection and the things that we so desperately need, while also makes it possible for us to be more innovative and to create more productivity than we ever could have created without it. And we'll see how we do as a species. I mean, I think that we're in the early days of the experiment.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said there, especially the part about lack of community and how we've gone away from that.
For sure.
And, my experience is that when kids, adults, when they really focus on creating value, they're not so extrinsically motivated. And I think it's going to be just making a perspective choice switch to where community relationships are truly what's most important. And these are amazing tools that I can choose to use or not, and I look at it and say, why would I watch mainstream news media when their business model is monetizing division? It's like, it's nuts. I'm not going to do that. And for me, my whole purpose is pushing out holistic value creation behaviors in the world. And in my companies, for sure, material value, really important. We want to cultivate and grow. We want to responsibly, continually increase that over time. It's so good for everyone. I think about the 3 to 5 year view on everything I do on decisions that way. But emotional energy to me is the scarcest commodity on the planet, supercharges everything else that we do. And it was the X factor for me as a leader and every leader that I've developed in my own businesses and others. And the spiritual value creation in the context of a business, it's a lot of what you're talking about. It's connectedness. So like the rituals, the things that we did to ensure that team members had opportunities to strengthen relationships. And even the largest company I had with 500 plus team members when I sold it in 2016, there's at least 100 of them that I stay in touch with today. We even had a policy, I don't know if you'll find this interesting, and I started it around 2000, where if an employee leaves for any reason whatsoever, the manager has to follow them for at least a year.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that sounds interesting.
That's interesting. Okay, so say that one more time. That's fascinating.
If an employee leaves for any reason whatsoever, the manager that they work for has to follow them for at least a year. And if they're wildly disgruntled, they had to give them to me to follow. And, there's some that I'm still following today, 20 years later, that when they left, they were really disgruntled, like this wasn't the right culture for them, but then they would go work for a prospective, customer like American Airlines. And within a year or two, they're sending us business because of that ongoing relationship.
Interesting.
Like, do we really care about relationships, or do we say that we care?
Man, it's so good because it speaks to one of the things we talk about in the company is being relational instead of transactional. And the worst part of business is that it can encourage tribalism and transactionality, that it's just like, all that matters is, are you on my side of the transaction? Are you not? And if you're not, then it's just, hey, basically the only use I have for you is completing the goal that I have. And if you can help me complete it, then I'm going to treat you well. And if you can't, then you're dead to me. And this is unfortunately how a lot of business happens in the world. And we really approach it totally different, that like, no matter what transaction is going on, there's people on the other side of it, and there's people all around it. And so we're going to treat people as people, regardless of whose team they're on or which side of the transaction they're on or whatever. And it really has helped us, I think, to make much deeper relationships with people. Sometimes even people, companies that, like a good example is I had a conference about generosity at our offices a few months ago. And one of the people that came was the CEO of one of our biggest competitors, because he just wanted to talk about generosity. And it's like, transactional behavior would be like, I never want to do that. But like when you're treating him as a person, it's like, hey, there's another business leader who wants to learn about how to incorporate giving into, his business. Like, absolutely, come on. And so I think it's that same idea that we've had people, like an example, we had somebody who we hired for a customer support role. She'd gone through a divorce. It was kind of a sad story, but she was in her 60s. We hired her, and it became obvious after a couple of weeks she just wasn't going to be able to pick it up. And so we had to, we very rarely have to do this, but we had to let her go after 2 weeks. But the way that we did it was such that she still comes by the office. She'll bring charcuterie boards up here and stuff. Like, there's a very positive relationship there. And I think sometimes the way I think about it is I have kind of like Mike the CEO hat, and then I have Mike the person hat. And sometimes I have to wear both of them, but I always try and treat people the way that they would want to be treated as people. And as a result, like you said, we just had a ton of different ways that's impacted the business in an unpredictably good way, because we treat people the way that we want to be treated.
Yeah, I think that's way. These are all relationships. They're all people, and I feel like to me it is completely separate. But when we combine them, it starts to get a little strange and uncomfortable. Yeah. How many team members do you have today?
We're at about 125 now. So I'm hitting the point in a company's growth where it's like I don't really deeply know everybody. I mean, there was a point where I knew everybody pretty well. And then it was like, I knew everybody a little bit. And now it's like, there's people where I'm like, okay, you got here like 3 weeks ago. What's your name? And that's kind of it's a hard period to go through when you're leading a company, when you're used to the culture being a certain size. It's also the point in our life cycle where I've got to focus more than ever on my job is leading and multiplying people and not doing the work, which is difficult. I've told people like I've been CEO for 9 years, but I've probably had 6 or 7 different jobs. And some of the jobs that I had, some of the things I had to do in the early years, if I was still doing them, they're directly negatively impacting the team and the business at this point, even if I'm very good at them. So it's an interesting period. It's the thing I love about running a company is that if you're good at it, the job keeps changing. And so the difficulty level, like we talked about earlier, always stays high.
Yeah, for sure. In our conversation here, did anything stand out to you as interesting or something you want to go deeper on?
Yeah, I think I really enjoyed several parts of it, partially because I want to listen back through it because I'm an external processor. And as you know, I've done a bunch of these, but there were 3 or 4 areas of this conversation where I talked about something differently than I've ever talked about it before, which is usually a pretty good sign that something about the conversation has led to a breakthrough in thinking. So I've actually, like, there'll be some where I'm like, I'm kind of saying the things I'd usually say. But this is one where I'm like, I think the ways that we've talked about a few of these subjects are different and a little bit, bespoke for me. And I'd love to figure out what's the actual breakthrough and clarity of thought that I had. And, what did you say that triggered it? That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. You said something earlier about if somebody says this is the way, really limiting. And I always look at it and say, well, this is the best way we can think of today, but it's our job to find a better way. And I like thinking about it like that. If our listeners want to learn more about the work that you're doing, how can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, the easiest way to follow me, if you want to look at the company, at simplemodern.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Mike Beckham SM, and same on LinkedIn.
Okay. Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this discussion. I wish I could have several more hours to explore different concepts with you because I love how you can go all around it the way you were describing it. There aren't a lot of folks that can do that. But I think everybody can be, sort of developed into being able to do that better and better. Some quickly, some might take a while, but I think it's a direction we can all go.
Yeah. Well, I enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you. And this has been the Show Your Value podcast, where we explore the art of value creation. If you got some value out of today's episode, please subscribe and like. And until next time, show the world your value.